When you got married, or if you're picturing the day you might, what do you think is actually making it real? Is it the vows, the rings, something spiritual actually happening in the room? Or is it the piece of paper that shows up a few weeks later, stamped by the government office you'll probably never think about again? Most of us have never actually asked that question. We just assume all of those things are pointing at the same reality, but they might not be. And figuring out which one is actually doing the work might change how you think about marriage entirely. Long before there was a government involved in marriage at all, there was a word for it. And the word, usually translated covenant, isn't just an old fancy way of saying contract. It's close to the opposite of one. The clearest place to see this is in the book of Malachi, where the prophet is confronting men who've broken faith with their wives. He doesn't call marriage a contract, he calls it a berith, Hebrew for covenant. And Hebrew had a different word sitting right there for a legal government-style agreement. Mishpat, an ordinance, a binding statute. The prophet doesn't reach for that word. He reaches for berith instead. And mishpat protects your interests. A berith remakes who you are from the inside out. So what did marriage actually look like under that word? In both the Old and New Testament world, it was mostly four things at once: a family arrangement, negotiated between households, not filed with a state, a covenantal bond witnessed by the community, and in Israel's case, by God, a real economic exchange, a bride price sometimes called mohar, closer to a public pledge of resources than a purchase, even though it sounds transactional now, and a relational status established through a process, not a single legal moment. There was no marriage license, no government registry, no officiant required by law. What held it together was family honor, a watching community, and a covenant made before God, not a piece of paperwork the state could grant or take away. You can see it in the stories themselves. When Ruth marries Boaz, he doesn't file anything with the magistrate. He stands at the city gate in front of the town elders and declares it out loud. They answer with the blessing. That's the closest thing to a wedding ceremony the Old Testament gives us, and it's entirely communal. When Jesus attends a wedding at Cana, there's no legal official anywhere in the story, just a celebration and his mother worrying about the wine. When Paul spends an entire chapter of instructions on marriage to the church in Corinth, who should marry, how to handle a mixed faith household, what widowhood should look like, he never once mentions Roman civil marriage law. Rome had plenty of marriage law on the books, consistent with a pattern across his letters. He just doesn't seem to treat Rome's legal categories as the relevant frame. So if marriage wasn't originally a government matter, how did we end up with a filing cabinet at the county clerk's office holding marriage licenses in the same drawer as fishing permits and business registrations? It happened slowly over about 1,000 years, and it wasn't one clean handoff. The first real shift came from the medieval church, which formalized marriage as one of its 7 sacraments in the 11th and 12th centuries. Still a church matter, not a civil one, the state wasn't involved yet. Then the Reformation did something almost backwards. Martin Luther and the reformers who followed him were reacting against what they saw as the church claiming too much authority over marriage. So they argued it was a good, holy order of creation, but not strictly a sacrament requiring a priest. That was meant to loosen the church's grip. Instead, it opened a door. Over the next few centuries, marriage drifted out of church courts and into civil ones, because once it wasn't sacred in the sacramental sense, nothing stopped the state from claiming it was an ordinary legal matter instead. The theologian Karl Barth pushed back on this centuries later, insisting marriage belongs to the order of creation itself, not to whatever arrangement the state happens to offer it. Notice what's actually shifting here. The question moves from, is this covenant real, to, did you follow the right process? Think about the last wedding you went to. How much of it do you actually remember? The vows? What was actually promised? Now think about whether anyone in the room checked the marriage license. The vows used to be the only question that mattered. Nobody checked the paperwork. By the 17th through 19th centuries, civil marriage registration had become standard across the West. And in the United States specifically, the marriage license has a documented history that includes being used in numerous states as a tool to prevent interracial marriage, a permission slip the government could simply decline to issue. That's not a footnote. It's one of the clearest demonstrations of what happens once marriage becomes something the state grants. It becomes something the state can also refuse to grant. And it's not distant history either. People alive today grew up under those laws. The legal historian John Witt Jr., who studied this longer and more carefully than almost anyone, makes a point that keeps this from being a tidy story either way. Modern civil marriage isn't a corruption of some pure biblical original. It's a hybrid. Roman contract law, medieval church law, and Reformation theology, layered on top of each other over 1,000 years. There was never a clean starting point that got contaminated. It's more like a braid than a line. Here's why this isn't just a history lesson. A contract and a covenant aren't just two paperwork categories. They're two different postures toward another person. A contract exists to protect your own interests in case things go wrong. That's not a bad instinct. It's often a wise one. But notice what it starts from. What happens to me if this fails? It's self-protective by design. A covenant starts somewhere else entirely. Not what happens to me if you fail, but what am I giving permanently? That's not the same claim as tolerating anything you do. Permanence and endurance of harm were never supposed to be the same promise. This series has spent a lot of time on a phrase for what happens when a person or relationship stops facing outward like that and starts curving back towards itself instead. In Curvatus in se, the self curved in on itself. A covenant built the way this one originally was, exclusive, permanent, witness, self-giving, is structured to resist exactly that curve. A contract left on its own is quietly built to accommodate it. So when marriage gets fully redescribed in contract terms, the prenup as the main conversation, love calculated like a risk-adjusted return, that's not a modern update. That's the curve finding its way into the one relationship that it was supposed to be its opposite. But it would be dishonest to leave it there, like the state showing up was purely a corruption. It's worth naming directly that contract logic isn't automatically the curve. It's curved when it replaces covenant as the primary language a marriage runs on, not when it's backing covenant up. That distinction is what the rest of this is actually about. Civil marriage law exists in real part because a covenant on its own has no enforcement mechanism when someone breaks it. A private vow witnessed only by a community gives you no inheritance rights if a spouse dies, no custody protection if things collapse, no recourse for an abandoned or abused spouse beyond whatever pressure that community is willing to apply, which history shows was often not much and applied far more harshly to women than men. Witt's hybrid isn't just historically accurate, it's doing real protective work that a purely covenantal model has on its own often failed to do. So the honest version of this isn't covenant good, contract bad. It's closer to what the theologian Stanley Hauerwas has argued. The mistake wasn't the church allowing civil registration to exist. It was letting the state's contract logic quietly become the primary language marriage gets described in, until covenant was just the poetry read at the ceremony, and contract became the operating system for everything after. So go back to the original question. What's actually making a marriage real? The vows, the community that witnessed them, the government form, or something underneath all three that none of them can fully hold on their own? Maybe the honest answer is that you need the paperwork and you need something the paperwork was never built to hold. But only one of those can be the actual soul of the thing. And it's worth asking honestly, which one is really running the marriage you're in or the one you're picturing? not what you say out loud at a dinner party. What's actually structuring the decisions you make when nobody's watching?